Good evening. Welcome to the Spring Emeriti Lecture. Tonight we have Susan Harding, who's Professor Emerita of Anthropology at UC Santa Cruz. I'm Eli Silver. I'm president of the Emeriti Association that co-sponsors this event. The function of these lectures is to highlight the amazing work that Emeriti faculty do after retirement. And the title of tonight's lecture is The Charisma of Anti-Satanism, Secularity in the 1980s Satanic Panic in America. And as I was mentioning to Susan, I was here in the 80s, and I don't remember a thing about that, so I'm really interested in hearing this. After the talk, there will be time for questions, and I'd like to thank the Chancellor for co-sponsoring this series. The lecture will be recorded and made available on the Emeriti YouTube channel. At this time, I'd like to invite Professor Mayanthi Fernando, who is Professor of Anthropology and the Provost of Kresge College at UC Santa Cruz, and she will introduce Susan.
So having organized many conferences and colloquia and talks, I've given a lot of introductions to eminent scholars, but this is truly the most difficult assignment I've had, not because I have nothing to say about Susan Harding, but because she is, as many of you know, impossible to pin down, a wily and wildly capacious thinker who continually pulls out the rug from under you, a real trickster if there ever was one. She has written about agrarian reform in Spain, Christian evangelicals in the US, American apocalypticism, conspiracy theory and therapeutic culture, nonfiction literature, and now the Satanic Panic and the Charisma of Anti-Satanism. These are the range of themes covered by Harding's published books and articles. And I'll explain in a moment about why I'll call her a trickster. But first, let me begin more formally with Harding's academic biography. Professor Emerita Susan Friend Harding received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Michigan, where she taught for a number of years before arriving at UC Santa Cruz in 1990. Her first book, Remaking Ibieca, Rural Life in Aragon under Franco, published in 1984, examined how villagers responded to agrarian reforms under the Franco regime by refashioning their ways of life to accord with industrial and consumer capitalism. She is perhaps best known, however, for her second book, the book of Jerry Falwell, Fundamentalist Language and Politics, published in 2000. On its face, an ethnography of the cultural movement that swept through many conservative Christian communities during the 1980s and 1990s, converting them from a marginal, anti-worldly people into a public and political force in the United States. Harding was particularly interested in the power of language and how Falwell and his co-pastors used the Bible's language to transform evangelical Americans' ways of inhabiting the world. I said on its face an ethnography, because any description of the book as simply an ethnography of Christian evangelicals doesn't do justice to the destabilizing force of that book, and to the way it opened up space in anthropology, not just to take seriously and therefore think seriously about contemporary evangelical Christianity, but also to turn the anthropological lens back to American secularity, including the secular academy, and to the common sense assumptions about history, politics, reason, and progress that many secular Americans, I would guess many of us here, that many secular Americans take for granted. This is the hallmark of Harding's work. As an anthropologist, she enters another world. As an ethnographer, she immerses her reader in that world. As an analyst, she elucidates the power of that strange world, what makes it a world rather than a worldview. And in taking seriously that strange world, as anthropologists like to say, She provincializes our secular rational world and destabilizes our certainties about it. And one of these certainties is the sense that these fundamentalists shouldn't be here at all. As Harding writes in a recent article, and I'm going to quote, something happened that we thought was impossible. Both our common sense and our intellectual theories had assured us for several decades that people like Falwell, fundamentalist preachers and their church folk, were disappearing, soon to be extinct, incapable of surviving in a world increasingly ruled by reason and science, by a government that separated church and state. And their unexpected presence, she continues, also took something away from us, something on which we relied just as surely as our sense of which way history was headed. It turned out that we were somehow dependent on our assumptions about who they were. If they weren't dying out as a social category, then we no longer represented the natural, normal, secularizing outcome of modern history. Our seemingly capacious, ecumenical, universalizing we became a particular and contingent we. It is to that we and our sense of destabilization that Professor Harding's current work turns, and her next book, The Book of Secular America, a sequel to the book of Jerry Falwell, takes up what she calls the making and unmaking of secular worlds in the late 20th century. I won't say much about that now, since I imagine she will tell us more about it tonight, other than to say that it seems especially important in this current moment when our sense of bewilderment, of history seemingly going back on itself, is especially intense. Let me end then, if I may, on a personal note. Susan Harding, Susan, has been, since I got here in 2008 as a very green assistant professor, Susan has been not just a colleague and a friend, but also a mentor, though she would probably hate that term. She has been a trailblazer in the anthropology of religion and the secular, not just by giving a generation of anthropologists who came after her the theoretical tools to understand non-secular worlds, but also by making space for us to be taken seriously within the academy. Susan was often asked how she could possibly take seriously those people and how she could possibly provincialize the certainties of our people. By insisting that such work is intellectually necessary, she made it possible for me to stand here now as a full professor and give this introduction. So it is truly my honor and my great privilege to welcome Susan Friend Harding up here to give the 2025 Spring Emeriti Faculty Lecture on the charisma of anti-Satanism, Secularity, and the 1980s Satanic Panic in America.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, my Auntie, for that generous introduction. I hope I can live up to it. And thank you, Eli, and for the invitation to give this lecture, and to Christy and the whole crew here that's made this lecture possible and functioning. And let's begin. First, I want to tell a little about how I arrived at this project, which means telling you a little more about my work in Lynchburg, Virginia with Jerry Falwell's congregation and Church World. As you know, he founded the Moral Majority in 1980, and I got there around 1982 and did work in his community for about 8 years, not for a month here and a couple months there and 2 weeks here and a month there over the course of 8 years. I chose not to stay there more than 2 months at a time. Given my academic training, I expected to find a religious people who were getting into politics. But what I found instead was a kind of narrative reformation, a world of stories and transition. Instead of studying belief and believers and religion and politics as if they occupied separate realms, I focused on narratives, on hybrid religious political narratives and their lively capacity to remake fundamentalists in their world. These are not so much stories that people tell as stories that produce people and potentially transform people and peoples. While I was in Lynchburg, some basic stories were undergoing this kind of transformation. For example, the story of a true conversion as truly coming to know Jesus as your Savior came to include the knowledge that abortion was murder. It was a sign of truly converting to Jesus Christ to be opposed to abortion. And their apocalyptic script, which is sketched out on the other pane, was changed from a call to withdraw from the world during the end times you see where the rapture is? Oh, that's in the middle, the rapture. And then the second coming. The end times happen right before the rapture. Or maybe it's right after, it wasn't clear. But it's a time of great turmoil. And if it happens, if Christians are still here for it, if we're already in it, in fact, they had been advised to just wait for the return of Jesus Christ and live out their lives as holy Christians. But during my time there, it was changed, the script was changed so that it became a call for an active political engagement of people in his community. And his community was not just in Lynchburg, it was by that time national, because he had a major media empire, TV and radio shows, as well as pamphlets and books and other kinds of literature. And so they were supposed to be politically active, if only through voting for pro-Christian candidates and donating money for the moral majority. He didn't demand, or they weren't demanded much, but they were demanded something in this new regime. They also re-narrated the non-fundamentalist Christian world, or as they would call it, the world, in ways large and small. They appropriated, subverted, and reconfigured the world's practices, events, viewpoints, and narratives. They revoiced the world in their own terms. It was an early version of what we call now owning liberals. If you focus on these images, there's one that I just am fascinated by how they could take up something like word processing and turn it into a Christian practice. But the other one is probably more serious, the cover story of their glossy magazine, which they started publishing in 1982. It features a secular humanist, a man who considers himself all-powerful and mighty and just, and converts the story. If you read the story and the kind of parodic image as well, they're converting secular humanism from, or the ideologies of the world, from merely sinful to an active, organized threat to Christianity, one that must be actively opposed. And I note here that I'm using the term Christians, beginning now, in a specific sense, not to include all Christians, but only politically and theologically conservative Christians, born-again Christians, evangelical Protestants, traditionalist Catholics. They also are obviously internally diverse, but I'm just going to lump these politically and theologically conservative Christians together and call them Christians. I don't mean to imply that nobody else is a Christian, just using their term. They do consider all other kinds of Christians atheists, basically. So preserve the term Christian for themselves. Anyway, while I was there, I did a kind of double critique, as my Anthony's already indicated. On the one hand, I was doing a critique of modern secularity, and I was, on the other hand, studying the Christian critique of the world. And so eventually I decided my next project would be about this Janus-faced critique, but from the vantage point, not of the Christian side, but from the vantage point of what I'm calling modern secularity. Modern secularity is an open-ended collection of practices that generate public, social, and institutional milieu in which the consensus reality, that is, the real world, is limited to natural and material beings, things, and events. And privately practiced religiosity is more or less normative. So, a few things to note about this definition. Secular here does not mean atheist, which is, it does mean in Christian discourses, if you're secular, you're an atheist by definition. I'm not using the term that way. But religion is specified as okay in the private arena, but not the public arena. In public, the supernatural is bracketed. So I would argue that secular modernity is a working consensus that mediates between other registers and versions of reality within major public institutions and knowledge-making practices. Most obviously other religions, but also all sorts of other kinds of differences are mediated by this lingua franca. And I'm not thinking of it so much as a worldview here. I'm thinking of it as an operating consensus about reality and legitimate knowledge. The institutions that are committed to secular modernity include science at one end. Very much stricter definition would apply, perhaps, in the case of science, but higher education in general, which I think of as a kind of citadel of secular modernity. It's where you go to get educated in secular modernity, at least certain, let's say, major liberal arts colleges and research universities. It also includes courts and the law, medicine, mental health, and at the other extreme, perhaps journalism, public education, and government. It's less operative in those realms, but still operates. So this operating consensus mediates differences inside public institutions, and those practices depend on specific norms that privilege empirical evidence, reason, and skepticism. Arguably, as Americans, we are all secular moderns to some extent, and most of us, I'd say all of us, also partake in other versions of reality and knowledge-making practices. So what does a satanic panic have to do with modern secularity? Well, I was looking for a case study, another case study of modern secularity in action. And I went, for some reason, I remember why, but I wanted to do it anyway. I reread my field notes from my field work in Lynchburg that I took over the course of about 8 years. And I found them shot through with Satan. It was he who awaited me when I died without Jesus in my heart, if I did. Satan was also behind abortion, slaughter of innocent children, and also the terrors of the apocalyptic end times. Although I never came to believe Satan was real, he became really real to me in Lynchburg. I was caught up in those stories, and Satan had gotten to me. It was clear to me in the repeated expressions of inner turmoil I found in my field notes. He'd really gotten to me. I also heard about Satan after I left the field. I talked to my main contact, my main friend in Lynchburg, Charlotte Gaylor, who invited me to live in her house. She's a very firm fundamental Baptist, but she said she was always attracted to the prohibited. When I asked her why she invited me to live in her house, she said she was always attracted to the prohibited, which I felt we had in common as a result, because that's why I was there. Anyway, I spoke to her in a phone call after I left Lynchburg in 1989 for the last extended stay. And she told me about some things that were going on in Appomattox, a town not far from Lynchburg. Appomattox was rife with rumors of satanic activity, and she didn't take them as rumors, she took them as true stories. There were elites who were running these satanic cults. They were kidnapping children, and they were organizing workshops on how to detect the signs of satanic activity in your community. This is the kind of thing that was going on in other communities. And I really wasn't aware of it. I went through the 80s kind of oblivious of the satanic panic too, even though I was in Lynchburg with these Christians. I just, filtered it out. Satan was a major figure in the Christian world of my fieldwork, as important as, say, Falwell or Jesus. But I left him out of my book. He's not in my book to speak of. He certainly doesn't carry the weight of the importance that he held in Lynchburg in my book. And I also left out the satanic panic going on in the world. I had tried to channel a relatively unfiltered version of fundamentalist reality in my book, the book of Jerry Falwell, but Satan was too much for me, too hot to handle. So I decided to come to terms with that. When I started reading about the satanic panic, I realized that I had my next case study, because the claims and allegations being made about criminal satanic cult conspiracy were a direct challenge to the modern secular consensus, and the critics of those claims and allegations responded in precisely those terms, that is, in defense of empirical evidence, reason, and skepticism. Shortly into this literature, let's see. Okay, so I mentioned, I mentioned Charlotte's stories about Appomattox, but there also at the same time came out an issue of the Fundamentalist Journal, which talked about the epidemic of Satanism in the world, not just in the religious communities, but he was beginning to make appearances in the world. And this issue of the Fundamentalist Journal was tracking those doings, and they mostly located it inside youth cultures. Fastest growing and most organized body of Satanists in the world. Countless teens have committed crimes, often suicide or homicide after dabbling in Satanism. And so this is the kind of literature that goes on in one of the what I call satanic circles. This is the double lens that I want to bring to this literature. On the one hand, there were anti-Satanists like those people in Lynchburg, but also, I will say, lots of people in the so-called secular world who were anti-Satanists, who were detecting satanic activity and fighting it. They believed in the satanic cult conspiracy and that there was a real satanic epidemic in the world. These were the anti-Satanists, and they were the ones making claims that challenged secular modernity. At some point during this period, anti-Satanist critics of anti-Satanism started to emerge. They relabeled what was going on the satanic panic. So I'm going to go back and forth between calling this a satanic epidemic and satanic panic. If you can keep track, when I'm talking about the epidemic, I'm talking about anti-Satanist claims. When I'm talking about anti-Satanists or the critics, and I'm talking about the satanic panic. Now, a couple more notes about these different positions inside what the critics called the satanic panic. Some of the anti-Satanists were Christians, but many were not. And they were all speaking, everyone was speaking in their secular roles as experts on Satanism, police officers, prosecutors, therapists, reporters, researchers, feminists, parents, and victims. Those are the main categories of activists against Satanisms. Belief in a literal Satan was not required to be an anti-Satanist. They were bound not by an identity or a tradition, but by a shared conviction that the satanic epidemic was real and that children were in grave peril in worldly terms. The critics, the anti-Satanists, spoke from within the same roles as well. And again, some were Christians and some not. They argued that the satanic epidemic was not real, and they used modern secular conventions to expose, contest, discredit, debunk anti-Satanist claims. I know it's tempting to see this conflict as between religion and the secular. After all, Satan descends from the Christian tradition. But at this moment, he was very much loose in the world as a figure. And he, not necessarily exactly supernatural, but the Satanists were dabbling, at least dabbling in it, and performing rituals that were communicating with Satan, possibly not. In any case, they were committing crimes. The debate between anti-Satanists and anti-Satanists was a secular conflict, not a debate about supernatural reality, but the reality of a criminal network of satanic cults. And on the one hand, you had the anti-Satanists and the critics. They were defending modern secularity. And on the other hand, you had these anti-Satanists. And I'm going to describe that as a kind of rogue secularity. They were not conforming to the rules of the modern secular consensus. And they were articulating different standards of what counts as evidence, reason, and skepticism, at least with respect to Satanism in America. So just to look a little more at the epidemic, what the anti-Satanists were arguing. Most of the claims, or a lot of them, were very much like the claims that I heard from Charlotte and that the Fundamentalist Journal was putting forward, and those both happened in 1989. Rumor panics, workshops on signs of satanic activity, and anti-Satanist campaigns against the occult, rock and roll, and video games, for example. Then beginning shortly after the publication of Michelle Remembers in 1980, the anti-Satanist movement expanded with new claims by adult survivors of what was soon called satanic ritual abuse. These were the major crimes that anti-Satanists began to accuse Satanists of. Michelle Remembers was co-authored by a Canadian psychiatrist, Lawrence Pasder, and his patient, Michelle Smith. Smith claimed to have uncovered repressed memories of childhood abuse by a satanic cult, which was part of a well-organized underground satanic cult conspiracy. As it turns out, I mean, it's hard to take this book seriously, at least for people like us, but it was if you study it carefully and take it seriously, you can see that it was a very powerful intersection of storylines and popular rhetorics. It was like a junction box or a railroad switchyard, combining discourses from child protection movements, that is, movements about child sexual abuse, child kidnapping, and pedophilia, from women's movements about rape, incest, pornography. And I include that issue of Ms. Magazine just to convince you that feminists were involved. This is Gloria Steinem's magazine, and she was a major advocate of the idea that satanic cults were running rife in America. In addition to these child protection movements and women's movements, there were insurgent therapy movements like recovered memory, multiple personality disorder, and a variety of therapeutic techniques for recovering memories. And finally, there was this ongoing set of stories about the satanic epidemic that was going on in the country. Now, Michelle Remembers was written as a memoir, and it was taken up as a true account in some therapy circles by some women who shortly began to report their own recovered memories of satanic ritual abuse as children. And it's just beginning to get off the ground here as something more than the satanic epidemic that Christians had started. It's becoming an event in the secular world in a new way. And by the way, some reviewers of this book even investigated it and decided that it was not a real account, that it was bogus. So it was debated from the very beginning. But lots of people took it up as a true account. And it was taken up specifically by not only women and some therapists, but by child abuse specialists in cities across the country. And as a result, the panic started to spread in 1983 and 1984 when children started making allegations of sexual ritual abuse involving extended families, babysitting services, most of all daycare centers. Allegations that led to hundreds of investigations and about 80 to 100 trials of accused Satanists. Children alleged that they had been sexually abused in what sounded like satanic cult rituals, including torture, mutilation, human sacrifice, dismemberment, and cannibalism. And these were described in great detail by the children as well as the survivors of ritual abuse, the adult survivors. Millions of Americans over the course of the 1980s and into the 1990s came to believe that the allegations were true, and they led to court cases that lasted well into the 1990s. Hundreds of men and women were accused, and at least 80 people were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. It's also the case that here's a list of some of these. This is an early effort to try and compile data on these allegations and the cases. This is from 1988. And it lists 36 investigations and ongoing trials. Now, in the course of this particular phase of the movement, the child abuse accusations, this is when anti-Satanism really got inside major public institutions and became a kind of rogue secularity. And by major institutions, I include the police, the FBI, prosecutors, courts, lawyers, therapists, doctors, child abuse specialists, and journalists. In addition, there were satanic cult experts, and some feminists and evangelists were involved, as well as the parents of the children who were victims. They built networks, they collaborated with each other, they held meetings, and they made trouble. Maybe not good trouble, but they made a lot of trouble. It was a decentralized but organized movement. And it also hit the major national media. There were lots of magazine stories, and then the tabloid TV got a hold of it. And there were several dozen major shows about satanic cults and devil worship. And they spread these stories as news about the epidemic, not as rumors, but as news. In other words, it's real, it's true. They invited adult survivors, child victims and their parents, therapists, police officers, and satanic cult experts to tell their stories as if they were all true and fact-based stories. In the context of all this, in the court cases and the ensuing media frenzy, critics of anti-Satanism emerged. They relabeled what was happening a satanic panic, not an episode of real satanic activity. And they began to document what was happening, to organize resistance, and to stage a decade-long debate in the public arena and in trials over the reality of satanic cults and, in effect, over the modern secular consensus. The critics relied on the concept of moral panic that was drawn from sociology, but used it loosely to focus attention on the scapegoating of a social group by other groups under the influence of some kind of collective paranoia or conspiracy theory. I keep calling it a satanic panic or panic, but I want to note that I'm trying to reframe it here and to emphasize its location inside public institutions and its operation as kind of a rogue secularity. The McMartin case was ground zero of the panic, as was LA County, city and county. How many people have heard of the McMartin case? Okay, so Eli, you're an outlier. Yeah. Other people were awake in the 1980s. It started with one parent's allegation that her child had been molested by one teacher at the McMartin preschool in Manhattan Beach in 1983. And it turned into allegations over the following months that hundreds of children had been abused by 7 McMartin teachers, 6 of them women, 1 of them a man, and that the preschool was a front for a highly organized sex abuse, pornography, and prostitution ring and a satanic cult that was part of a multi-generational, international satanic conspiracy. This was the common sense knowledge among anti-Satanists who were activists on this issue. This is the same arc of allegations, from one allegation to hundreds of them, and one person to many people. This arc occurred in dozens of other cases, most of them, in fact. McMartin was also exemplary of the deviations from modern secularity as it governed forensic and judicial protocols. There was a lot of police misconduct, botched investigation, and inflammatory actions. Hundreds of interviews of children by unqualified counselors using untested protocols. And there were media frenzies. There were posses of parents doing their own investigations, and prosecutors filed reams of charges based on probable or no evidence whatsoever. So the modern secular standards were suspended in these cases, and the rogue secularity was running amok. The critics of anti-Satanism took a few years to get their counter movement off the ground and to have some effect. Their critiques included, this is the FBI turned around full circle and became the central source of skepticism about the reality of satanic cult conspiracy, arguing that its agents could find no hard evidence of a satanic cult's conspiracy or satanic cults of any kind, really. There should have been, for instance, if there were thousands of babies being sacrificed, there should have been some material evidence, and they never found any. And they decided that this was definitive as far as they were concerned. There should have been evidence, and there was none. Also, experts were exposed as frauds or lying. In addition, there were major case studies involving lots of academics and lawyers and other experts who documented the misconduct and placed the daycare cases in particular in a larger context of unsubstantiated rumors and claims about a satanic cult conspiracy that were swirling around. There were critiques of the medical evidence and of the techniques for interviewing children, of recovered memory therapy, of multiple personality disorder. They were all disputed. And it was argued these techniques were producing false memories, not true memories. So, and this amounted to an alternative explanation of where these testimonies were coming from. One of the things that the anti-Satanists said is, well, how could all these people be saying the same thing? And so they argued, the critics argued, that in effect the interviews and the therapy sessions were contaminated by the interviewers and the therapists and others who came to those situations assuming that satanic ritual abuse was real. False memory. You see the False Memory Syndrome Foundation? Yeah, that was an innovation of this critique. There was also critiques of media practices. Geraldo Rivera actually issued an apology for the show he produced in 1987. He didn't apologize until 1995, but still, it was quite remarkable. The media began to adopt the panic storyline rather than the epidemic storyline. They had been running with the epidemic during the 80s. Around 1990, there started appearing TV shows and stories that argued that what was going on was a panic, not an epidemic. The anti-Satanists also developed explanations of what was going on, and none of them really worked for me, I don't think. They rooted it in anxieties and fears about social change. To me, this is kind of a generic explanation that you can use to explain almost anything that doesn't sound reasonable. It's just such standard operating social science explanatory behavior that I kind of don't listen very carefully to it. I think there's something there, but they didn't do enough thinking about what was going on to make sense, to make that sound credible to me. Anyway, the critiques worked. I don't think the explanations did, but the critiques did. Beginning in the early 90s, the number of court cases declined, and charges were increasingly dismissed, either before or during the trials, including in 1990 those against the remaining McMartin defendants. There were overturned verdicts, there were exonerations, wrongful conviction suits, fraud charges, civil suits, canceled insurance for recovered memory therapy, and multiple personality disorder therapists. What you see here is taken from the National Registry of Exonerations that's run by the University of Michigan. And These are 30 of the 60 exonerations specifically for accusations of satanic ritual abuse. The first 20 or so, I ordered them this way so you could see, if you look at the fourth or fifth column, they're all from Kern County. There was a major case in Kern County. If you were in California and missed the one, the McMartin case, you might have heard of the Kern County or the Bakersfield case. It was very big, and dozens of people were convicted and put in jail right away, like in 84, 85. As a result of the critique, forensically credible child interview protocols were developed, and the media stopped reporting satanic epidemic stories as news and instead covered the events as a satanic panic. Eventually, the cases stopped altogether, and it seemed like it had all gone away until recently, when it begins to appear again in the headlines beginning around 2016, associated with Pizzagate and QAnon, and even I don't go up to this point, but I think it was even alleged as having something to do with the January 6th insurrection. As a result, and the way they describe the panic, it sounds very much like the panic from the 1980s. Kidnapping children, ritualized sexual abuse and murder, a cabal made up of, in this case, Democratic Party politicians, Hollywood celebrities, members of the government deep state, and of course, President Trump was waging a war on this demonic cabal, which was called the Storm. Deborah Nathan and Kenneth Lanning, two of the best anti-Satanist critics, were very dismayed by this reappearance of the satanic panic. They thought it was over. As you can see, Deborah Nathan, journalist, thought it was going to go away. She couldn't believe it was happening again. It's been very difficult for her. She realized that none of what she did really mattered. None of what we did really seems to have made much of a difference. And Lanning is a little more philosophic in this instance, and he said he came to realize that one of the most relevant topics that you could ever talk about was this story. It's not about satanic ritual abuse so much as what people believe when there's no real objective professional evidence of it. It's an amazing thing to behold. Now these are high-end secular modern critics who are just dumbfounded and very dismayed over this turn of events. I think what this shows to them and what it shows to me is that the debunking practices of the 1980s worked up to a point and then they stopped working. They got rid of this panic inside these public institutions, but not outside them. It ran amok, as you could say, in the world, and kept evolving. And you can trace its movements, actually, through the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and its reappearance. And I think the term satanic panic, the techniques were part of the problem, and the term satanic panic was part of the problem, because it masked, it stopped thought. It masked what this further unfolding from people like me, at least, from secular moderns, for whom out of sight is out of mind when it comes to this sort of unreason. And so what I started thinking about was a different kind of narrative truth that was at work here, a narrative truth, or a zone of narrative truth that exists between two categories of truth that are sanctioned by modern secularity: fact-based truth and fiction. You can have creativity and imagination and all kinds of things over here, but you must understand it's fiction as opposed to fact. And we try and keep the rest of it, anything in between or anything that puts those two things together in a mischievous way, we keep them out of public life. But in fact, it's a quite lively zone when you open it up. This is just a word cloud of some of the words that occurred to me that describe these mischievous hybrid truth-tellings. Some of them are edgy and experimental genres, but a lot of them are, and there are a few more secure, respectable forms like religious truth or some religious truth. But largely it's an unruly mix of pejorative terms. And when I focus on them from a good secular modern point of view, not a particularly anthropological point of view, but a strictly modern, secular modern point of view, and I look at the suspicious and dangerous forms that people this in-between zone, I think what comes to mind is, well, poor education. This is emotional. These are unreasonable people. It's illiberal. It's dirty politics. It's Trump. These are all things that occur to me when I think of things like panic, brainwashing, falsehood, lies, bull, hoaxes, irrationality, conspiracy theory, mind control. These people aren't thinking straight. So a lot of these terms have to do with disciplining bad behavior in what I would say is the public or political arena. You can do this in private, but when it gets loose in public life, it's to be disciplined. And it can be called, in some instances, a panic. 30 years after writing Folk Devils and Moral Panics, Stanley Cohn, the sociologist, came to a similar conclusion. He redefined the concept moral panic in a way that de-emphasized both the moral and the panic. Kept calling them moral panics, but he said they were condensed political struggles to control the means of cultural production. Studying them allows us to identify and conceptualize the lines of power in any society and the ways we are manipulated into taking some things too seriously and other things not seriously enough. I like this kind of redefinition, but it does miss one thing, and it's a big one, that in this case, the two sides are playing by different rules. They are governed by different norms of what counts as evidence, reason, reality, and knowledge. So, in conclusion, I'd say that the satanic panic of the 1980s prefigured our current political situation. Now an updated satanic panic and other forms of unruly narrative politics control a lot of public real estate. They have their own universities and media outlets, and they own the Republican Party, half of the state governments, and a good deal of the federal government at this point. Whatever we call it, by now, it's no longer a rogue secularity. It's a rival secularity. And that's as far as I've gotten, and I'm really wondering what you think. Oops.
Thank you, Susan. That was very illuminating for me, for sure. Okay, now I'll open this up for questions. And please wait until, do we have microphone? Please wait till someone with a microphone comes up to you, but raise your hand and they will come up and let you ask a question. There's one.
These are suggestions for further reading. I know you're probably wanting to read more about this. But.
Hello, and thank you so much for that presentation. I guess the question I kind of am left wondering is, you connected that era and that panic to the current situation we're in, but it also left me wondering, is this a particularly American kind of stupid, or is it something that happens in a lot of different places? Is it just a modern thing? If you have any thoughts on that, on how that works culturally and nationally.
Well, the Satanic Panic, I didn't mention this, but the Satanic Panic occurred in other countries. They were mainly in the Anglo world, because I think it was Satanic cult experts went to these other countries, English-speaking countries, and spread the panic. It was in Canada. It was in the British Isles. It was in several countries in Europe. It was in Australia, New Zealand. So specifically, the Satanic Panic was pretty widespread. But the thing I'd compare it most to in this country is McCarthyism, probably. But I would say that I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't think it's exceptionally American. I do think Americans really like this in-between zone of narrative truth. And I don't think it's necessarily a fault. I think it's a very exciting zone, and can open up a lot of worlds that make sense of things. What occurs to me is the arguments made about P.T. Barnum in the 19th century, and the kind of hoaxes that attracted millions of people, or I don't know, hundreds of thousands, I don't know, was it millions? Yeah, it was millions of people. People want to be hoaxed. They want to have to figure out, is this real or is this true? And some of them were quite convincing, others not. So that's a kind of entertainment version of this kind of activity. There's lots of stuff on TV that explores this realm. Needless to say, Hollywood is very good at this. I think this way of analyzing it is peculiarly American, but I don't think the phenomenon is.
Thank you. Hi, Susan. That was great. You said early on that you had done 8 years in Lynchburg, and even though there were like 3 major figures, you treated only 2 of them. So I'm wondering, now that you're really seriously engaged with Satanism, anti-Satanism, and anti-Satanism, I mean, just to put it in really blunt terms, what does Satan mean to you? If you know what I mean. I mean, what is the status of Satan in the way you are treating this subject?
I guess when I was, with respect to my book, people did ask me, what did Jesus mean to me as a result of doing this work? I had trouble answering that one, and I have trouble answering this one. What does Satan mean to you?
It's a joke. It's a red guy with funny little horns. I mean, it's like nothing. Like, yeah, whatever. Yeah,
I don't take Satan seriously, but I'm really impressed by people who do. And I think it behooves us to take Satan seriously for that reason. And the churches that I have visited recently spend some time talking about the reality of Satan, because they know the world doesn't take Satan seriously. And he's a joke. He's a little red guy in He dresses up in red clothes. And, this Church of Satan, which is a kind of a Michelle Remembers-like text in the history, the prehistory of all this. The Church of Satan, which is quoted, including in Michelle Remembers, as a major organization and source of satanic activity in this country, that was a parodic, performative episode. It was not meant to be taken seriously by the leaders or the followers of the Satanic Church. They didn't believe Satan was real. They didn't believe God was real. They weren't into religion. They hated Christianity. It was an attack on Christianity. They were right to respond to it in that sense, but it wasn't a matter of believing in Satan. They didn't think they thought Satan was a little red guy with horns. But it was interpreted as a serious threat. So it's what happens when you have these dueling narrative regimes. You could say one thing and it gets taken up in another way, and suddenly you're somewhere else altogether. So I guess I'm advocating this, when it comes to things like this, a kind of double lens on it, so that we not only think of it in our terms, but their terms too.
Yeah, so much to ask and think about. I'm thinking that no facts come without their narratives. Facts are inconceivable, literally, without narratives, including in physics, the narratives that fuel those kinds of facts. But I'm more interested in asking you about when the term secularity loses its potency for you. You started with the opposite, with the binarism between religious and secular, and set it out really well. But the energy of the talk is in that rogue secularity, in that domain that can't quite be pinned down. And you ended by calling it no longer a rogue secularity, but a viable secularity. And there was some point in the set of movements that I kept wanting some other word than secularity. It's certainly not religious. It's certainly not stupid. It's certainly not a lot of things. But I don't know when the concept of secularity for you stops helping.
Yeah, I am doing something to the word secularity here. I'm not owning it for people like, say, most of us. And I'm using it to refer to a consensus of what counts as reality and legitimate knowledge-making practices in public institutions. So it could take other forms. I qualify the kind of secularity folks like us practice as modern secularity. It's also called liberal secularity. And it presents itself as the only true form of secularity. But I'm, yes, exploring the possibility that there's certainly variations of modern secularity. And you could call this rogue secularity a kind of modern secularity too. But, it doesn't qualify by most standards. So I'm sort of in transition on that. And I also want to acknowledge that facts always have narratives. But there's a difference between fact-based narratives and narratives that aren't fact-based. And that's what I was pushing the boundary of here. Is that enough? Yeah, I'm sure.
So, hi, it's Terry Burke. So, this is going to seem like a curveball, and so I want to get it set up in the right way. But have you ever thought of roaming around the Islamic world with this idea? Think, for example, of the way in which things came out in Syria, not once but multiply. Here they go again. And we were being told that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, names that should drive terror into the hearts of Americans, right, are on our side. and are killing the upholders of secularism, namely Assad and all of those who back him, right? So that's one dimension of this, right? Then you get into, okay, so what's real and what's not real? And you start thinking about, oh, so what was it with the white helmets? Who were those people? The ones who got the Oscar, remember those, right? And they had this amazing theory that was being closed down by God-fearing secularists like Assad, who said that, imposed to what they were saying, that Assad actually was perpetrating chemical warfare on the Syrian people. And who are these people who are supporting al-Qaeda and so on? Are they even Syrian? It turns out mostly they were not Syrian, right? So and many of them even were Americans, ex-GIs, who were down on their luck and liked the money of going and joining these groups and getting to stand and pose and chop people's heads off in public to be displayed on people's TV sets. Right, so we're in a world that is very dark and plays lots of different games with our heads. There was no evidence that the chemical warfare in question ever occurred. People who were employed by the International Bureau for Identifying Chemical Weapons, who were on the scene, denied it. Right, so I'm going to move out of this particular scene, but it continues to be a little game that can be played, right? So there's a way in which these kinds of accusations, the kinds of fear and terror that they put in our hearts, the way in which they say that Hamas is evil and must be eradicated, that kind of thinking, right? What do we do with that? Pause. Okay, so now let's just switch slightly in a different direction, because a lot of the thinking is similar, right? So what do we do then with what our
Terry,
yeah?
you give me enough to respond.
All right. So I got another whole broadside, but go ahead and do that one.
Okay, I don't know how to answer your question. I would say that the terms by which the world exists as we have understood it are in flux, and they're in flux differently everywhere. And I at this point don't want to take this kind of thinking anywhere else. I'm not sure it would do any good in Syria. That sounds really mind-boggling. Yeah, I'd like to find out more.
There's some questions down here first. Yeah.
So I know one of the leading theories of the Salem witch trials is that the people in the city had eaten some disease dry, which had turned into LSD. I was wondering if there's any connection to psychedelics from the 60s and 70s that could have influenced the Satanic Panic.
Well, the psychedelics were certainly seen as a satanic activity and condemned by anti-Satanists. It was one of the features of youth culture that they took to be a signal of Satanism. But I think you're asking me more about its relationship to Satanism. Am I right? Or as evidence? I'm not quite sure what your question is.
I don't know. I thought of that connection, and I figured I'd ask and kind of see where you went with it.
Okay.
Because you know more about it than I do.
Well, I don't know. I haven't thought about this particular connection.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
One more here and then go back.
Thank you. Susan, thanks for that talk. And it seems like there is I don't know what to call it, a politics and an ethics to what you're proposing, a kind of implicit, and therefore we should. And I wanted to see if you could talk that through a little bit, because what you were pointing to, I think, were the limits of the move of debunking, the limits of the notion of panic, the limits of going to empirical evidence, reason, and skepticism. And so could you maybe, it seemed like there is an implicit and therefore we should do this instead.
I'll say a couple of things. I do think that the dominant consensus is quite restrictive and, if you will, unrealistic and debilitating in some ways. I think it disables us from understanding what's going on right now as much as anything else. And I think when I think of what's happening to us now, you mentioned this in the introduction, I think of us as having lost hegemony. We can't assume that the future is going to unfold on our terms. It seems to be taking a radical turn to the right, maybe backwards. So we're beginning to develop a double consciousness. We're beginning to hear what they're saying about us and see ourselves through their eyes, and it's very, very disturbing. I just want to push it a little further and say, instead of just sort of freaking out under that and feeling oppressed, that we should begin to appropriate and talk back, which means we have to really pay attention to what they're saying. Now, the people who do it best right now are comedians and people doing parody. They really listen pretty carefully to what is coming from these outlets and contesting it. Our politicians are not doing so good, on the other hand. I don't think, I guess I despair a little. I think, and let me be clear, I think things need to proceed as they are. I think everybody has to do everything that they can possibly do, but they also need to do more and other things, and that maybe we could think of our own secularity, and not as breaking it up or abandoning it by any means, but making it a little more robust, a little more curious about what they're saying and what we can talk back to. For instance, they're making a serious critique of the federal government and bureaucracy. Well, we should probably do that too, and do it better than they do, and integrate that into our offense rather than just defend what we must defend. Yes, absolutely. So I'm thinking of our current. I want to think about the double consciousness as an advantage rather than a disadvantage. It's the advantage of backwardness, not the way it's usually thought of, but the way I like to think of it. And that this is what I saw in Lynchburg. This is what they were doing. They were using their marginal position and building out from there. They had been subjected to the terms of the world for decades and suffered many defeats, but they got really smart and learned secular discourses to a perfect pitch. They started their own law schools. They became lawyers. They are now changing laws and enacting new laws. So, like that. I have more. This is where I'd like to go from here, but it's late, and time for one more question.
Late, but I want one more. I think Gail, or someone back here.
Hi. My question revolves mostly with America has gone through a bunch of these witch trial-like events with the Satanic Panic of the 80s and the multiple times we've gone against with Red Scares and stuff. My main question revolves around, why is it always the right? Why is it always the Republican Party? Why
It's not. Think about the crack cocaine epidemic and the drug war. That was a kind of panic, and that was run by the federal government and local governments. And it's straight out of the playbook of modern secularity. And a lot of black people went to jail You know, I think, and this was going on at the same time. You know, that's another talk altogether, but I do think there are, it's not always the right. And we don't think of when we are doing it, or the federal government's running it, as a panic, but it is. And arguably, a good deal of what became the Satanic Panic came out of federal government studies and conferences and legislation in the 70s. So, yeah, I think it's not always from the right.
Okay, well, I think we have gone over.
There are other people who want to talk.
All right, okay.
Can we go over, you want to talk 2 more minutes or 5 minutes, and then Gail? And
Go for it.
I had one quick question. As someone who was not around in the 80s, I was like shocked to hear the amount of cases that were linked between child sexual abuse and satanic rituals. I did not know that was a thing. And so I was just curious if, for any of those cases, was there some gray zone in maybe some of these being valid sexual abuse claims that may have been muddled by adults being panicked about video games and rock music, or if these were truly kind of curated, bogus, I guess, trials that from beginning to end were not really coming from reality?
this is a great question, and it leads me to tell you about the anti-Satanists. Yes, and they call themselves that. They do a critique of the witchcraft narrative, not of the critique so much as, well, yes, of the critique, as obscuring the fact that there was real cases of sexual abuse. And in fact, some of the people who were convicted in these trials did not get out of jail. I think probably some of them should have, but some of them should be in jail. I think it set the whole cause of figuring out how to adjudicate cases of child sexual abuse, which was really just getting off the ground in the late 70s. I think it set the whole process back at least 10 or 15 years and put a lot of innocent people in jail. Some people were guilty. I think it distracted attention from cases that were perfectly valid. But when I say it, I don't mean the critique, I mean the panic and the kind of melding of satanic ritual abuse and child sexual abuse. You couldn't tell them apart. Once people were not charged with satanic ritual abuse, they were charged with child sexual abuse. But once this other narrative rode piggyback and sort of began to kind of consume the other accusations, you couldn't tell them apart. So people were on trial for Satanism as much as child sexual abuse. And they lost their bearings in that context. It's hard enough to prosecute child sexual abuse. You don't need this on top of it.
Thanks, Susan, for really thoughtful, difficult work at a hard time. You did a really good job of cutting off our first, second, and third most sloppy tendencies for how to explain all of this, what you might call the basket of deplorables explanations. But you said something in passing that I wanted to ask you to say something more about, which is people just really want to be hoaxed. And you know, what an interesting, vibrant, fun, you didn't use the word enchanting, but it's kind of what you were talking about, realm that is there, that is something that seems missing from the kind of what used to be standard secularity and is apparently now in decline. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the juice of that and how that figures in an analysis as we go forward and try to think about this.
Well, I think there's a certain kind of excitement of coming into contact with the unknown and the unknowable and uncertainty, and it can produce a reaction, which is to shut it down, but it's also exciting. It's the world of the uncanny. It's the world beyond normal ways of explaining things. And we all have contact with that realm in many ways. When it comes up around your children, Debbie Nathan, Kenneth Lanning and Debbie Nathan, they're my go-to people for anti-Satanism, because they just wrote so much and wrote so well about it all, and so carefully. Debbie Nathan first encountered satanic accusations when they began to circulate in El Paso, and she worried about what was happening to her children. And she got caught up in it too. I mean, it's terrible to imagine that your children are in such risk, and that such things are possible. They need to be investigated. And Kenneth Lanning had the same reaction when he first started hearing these allegations. Before the McMartin case, when the FBI was consulted on cases that were brought to it by women, adult survivors, and alleging satanic ritual abuse in their childhoods. And he first thought it was probably true. It needed to be investigated. So anybody's susceptible to this, especially when it touches close to home. It's where you go with it, I guess, and who you hang out with. And then, I don't know, you're leading me to think I need to explain how people get caught up in QAnon or something, and that's a big one. I think there are lots of different reasons. And I think to some degree we're all susceptible under the right conditions.
Are there any Zoom questions? No.
One more from an enthusiastic arm at the back of the room.
Wait, I wrote it down. All right. So, as the Christians who perpetuated this movement, or were the Christians who perpetuated this movement receptive to allegations of child abuse by the Christian churches they were a part of, if there was any?
Wait a second. You mean the people who were making these claims, were they accused of child abuse?
No, more like the Christian church doesn't have a super stellar record of not engaging in child abuse. Was there as much outcry for these cases as there was for the Satan?
No, as you know, that's been covered up for a long time. And one argument that's made on the margins of the kind of weak explanations that float around this anti-Satanist literature is that this was a kind of deflection from real allegations of child abuse that were beginning to emerge, including, importantly, in the LA area, in Catholic churches and in Protestant ministries, evangelical, especially Pentecostal and charismatic ministries that were practicing exorcism and spirit possession. So that I don't like to think of these things as deflections, but they certainly did deflect. I don't think they were. The movement caused the deflection, but I think they did deflect, if I can make that distinction.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Let's wrap this up and have some.
Thank you, Susan. And